Hi, everyone. Welcome to Storms on the Way, an American Gods podcast. I'm Alistair Stevens, and over the course of the next 11 weeks, we are going to be looking at both Neil Gaiman's seminal novel and the upcoming Starz TV adaptation. We have a few weeks until the show begins, so we're going to begin with the book, moving through it in two-chapter increments. I know that a lot of people anticipating the show are now reading American Gods for the first time. So I want to reassure you right up front that this is going to be a no spoilers podcast. We are not going to anticipate the movement of the book in these discussions. We're going to focus on where we are. And when we get to the turns, as we inevitably will, we'll discuss them then. So if this is your first reading, you can follow along. As long as you've read the two chapters that we're covering each week, you'll be able to keep up just fine without fear of being spoiled. American Gods was written by Neil Gaiman and was published in June of 2001. It won many awards, received enormous critical and popular acclaim. It sold a lot of copies. It was a huge commercial success. 10 years later, as part of the 10th anniversary celebrations, it received a new edition. And as I said, at the end of April, it's getting a TV show on Starz, which is perhaps the most appropriate and interesting place for American Gods to appear. We're going to discover, as I said, the novel in great. We're going to discover and discuss. That was an interesting slip of the tongue. We're going to both discover and discuss the novel in great depth and the show, hopefully, in equal depth. Two, I haven't yet seen the show. Obviously, the screeners have not yet gone out, so we're still anticipating the show. But the pre-release material looks extremely promising. And over the course of the last few years, Starz, I think, has earned our trust when it comes to these high-profile adaptations, and of course, original series too. You can join in every one of these live sessions by taking part here in the YouTube chat. I see a number of people right here. Yes, if we can try and keep spoilers to a minimum here in the YouTube chat, that would be fantastic. I appreciate it. Feel free to email me with spoilers. I always appreciate those discussions too. But right here in the YouTube chat, you can contribute questions, thoughts, comments as we move forward. You can also contribute via Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW, StormsOTW, STORMSOTW. And I will see those through the week. If you have other thoughts that might take more than 140 characters to express, for example, then you can get in touch with me directly via email at pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. If you are unfamiliar with me, if you're unfamiliar with the kind of work that I do at Point North Media, a quick frame here. We're going to be studying the text of these stories. We're going to be studying the text of the book and the text of the TV show. I'm not generally terribly interested in behind-the-scenes production detail, except where it's directly relevant or particularly fascinating. Instead, we're going to perform a kind of close reading, where we interpret the text and see what depth we can discover, see what we can draw out from it, see what thematic and symbolic and metaphorical understandings we can arrive at. We're going to be looking very closely, of course, at the movement of the plot, at the characters, and at the rich and layered and provocative symbolism that completely permeates this book from cover to cover. I first read American Gods a few years ago and was immediately blown away by it. Of course, it stands apart, I think, even in Neil Gaiman's body of work. It stands apart as a novel of exceptional ambition, of unique aspiration, and also of, I think, spectacular accomplishment. It is not always an easy book to read. It is certainly a challenging novel to try to understand, to try to fully apprehend. But hopefully in the course of these discussions, we'll be able to unlock this book a little bit and share what makes it so very, very special. I have a number of people here with me in the YouTube chat here. Oh, we're celebrating Bryan Fuller already. Of course, Bryan Fuller, one of the great draws of the TV version. Yes. Yes, and we're talking a little about the other stories that Gaiman has shared. Vivian says that this is her first Gaiman book. That's fascinating. I think that's true for a number of people, actually. He has had, of course, high-profile successes, both in novels and in other media. He's a remarkably skilled, a remarkably deft writer in a number of different forms. But I think the novel is where he shines best. And I would still argue, I think, that American Gods is the pinnacle of his work. It's damn near the apotheosis of his work. I should say, too, before we get into this, that many of you have come with me on other literary journeys. Many of you have studied alongside me Outlander and Pride and Prejudice and Harry Potter, and maybe you are studying with me right now the works of J.R.R. Tolkien in the series There and Back Again. This is going to be a slightly different seminar. I know that a lot of listeners like to listen to the podcast while they are cooking, or while they are cleaning their house, or while they are in the car with their children. Let me say right up front that for obvious and necessary reasons, this will be more R-rated and explicit than the other seminar series that I've done. There will be language and scenes of a sexual nature contained in this week's reading, in fact. So if you are listening to this in mixed company, if you are watching this in mixed company, now would be a good time to usher the children out of the room. Maybe go pack them off with a DVD of Coraline or something like that. And then we can talk as adults talk about this story. Yes. The Coraline book is excellent, and the movies are great too, says Kate. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Angela says, it was my first Gaiman book 17 years ago. It's been, guys, it's been such a long time since this book came out. I should say too, right up front, that we are using the author's preferred edition. Specifically, I am using this lovely edition of the author's preferred edition. If you don't have the author's preferred edition, I wouldn't worry about it too much. When Gaiman returned to the book after a decade, he had a few new ideas about material that he wanted to include, material that had been excised by the editor on the first version of the book. So the author's preferred edition is about 12,000 words longer than the original edition, but the arc of the story remains largely intact. The shape of the story remains largely intact. There are incidental scenes which are added, but if you're following along in one of the first the first revision titles, then you'll be able to keep up with the story just fine. And if there's occasionally a slide that you don't recognize, well, that's just a little extra Gaiman for you to enjoy. These sessions are going to run around 90 minutes. That's the plan. As I said, we're going to run for the next 11 weeks. Once the show starts, we're going to be doubling up. There will be 2 sessions a week. One of those will be a pre-recorded podcast in which I'll discuss the latest episode of the show. That will go out every Monday after the show airs on Sunday night. And then we will normally be doing this show, this live session here, this interactive session, on Tuesday evenings. It's been a little difficult this week, and I apologize for those of you who showed up on Tuesday, only for the show to be bumped to Wednesday, and then showed up on Wednesday, only for the show to be bumped to Friday. It has been a week of technical adversity here at Point North Media, but everything seems to be working now. I'm very glad to have you here all with me. This is wonderful. Let's get into it then, I guess. And we're going to begin not by beginning the book, but by framing the book a little bit. If you've read the author's note at the beginning of the author's preferred edition, and if you've certainly heard Neil Gaiman talk about this novel, then you will know that one of his explicit undertakings was to explore America. And in so doing, he has created a broadly unique, obviously there are elements borrowed from existing mythologies, but he has created effectively a unique and integrated and comprehensive mythology for the United States. And I wanted to talk a little about mythologies. I wanted to talk a little about the purpose of mythologies and about really the best lens through which to view this book. Because while this book is magical realist in a sense, while this book anchors us very directly to the real world, to real places and real feeling, naturalistic people and real experiences, it doesn't quite work as a conventional adventure story. You need, I think, to layer this with this lens, with this metaphorical lens of mythology. Mythologies exist in their aggregate to define and to unify cultures. Individual myths have a number of purposes. Individual myths can explain why the sun rises and sets, why rainbows occur, why dogs and cats are mortal enemies. Myths explain the world around us, either with literal and specific points of reference. Why do rainbows happen? There's a myth to explain that, I'm sure. Or more figuratively, why do we encounter death? How do we resolve the snarled tangles of love and loyalty and passion and obsession? We can resolve all of these things with myths. Pandora's box is a myth that explains all of human suffering in a very efficient fashion, actually. The Garden of Eden is a myth that does something similar. Individual myths can have many purposes, can be put to many uses. But when they are taken together in aggregate as a full and unified mythology, they do something different, which is they speak to our core identity, that identity that lurks beneath ourselves, that identity that like the tide of the ocean. We are tugged and swayed by our cultural milieu, and that cultural milieu can be defined by that unified mythology. It defines who we are, and it defines who we are not. And of course, the notion of creating a unified mythology for the United States of America is a really interesting challenge, because the United States, unlike most other cultures, unlike most other nations, most other tribal identifiers, is a consciously and deliberately constructed thing. The United States began with a notion of what the United States could be, the notion of a nation, if I can borrow from Hamilton, and God knows I will frequently at every opportunity. That conscious act of creation, the idea that the United States is the first nation founded upon an ideal or a set of ideals, means that mythology functions very differently. America, that combination of the United States and the older cultures that pre-existed within these spaces, and that point of intersection is something crucial, which we will examine as we move through even today's reading. That cultural America, that sense of America as not simply a place, not simply as a people, but as an ideal, as a principle, as a collection of virtues and motive forces, that identity of America is defined beautifully by Gaiman in the course of the book. Again, it's not always easy, it's not always simple, it's not always unprovocative, I suppose, but it is curious and respectful, and it does speak to that sense of America in a number of different ways. And we're going to try and pick apart those ways, I think, as we move through the seminar series, as we begin to interact directly with these myths, and then on increasing scales with these myths, we're going to continue to look at the ways in which those myths interact with our notion of America. What is this saying, this book, about the United States specifically? What is it saying about the United States that can only be said about the United States? And curiously, of course, because Neil Gaiman, famously not an American, what does it say about the United States that an American would never say about the United States? So I want to keep in mind constantly as we move forward that framework. American Gods is about primarily America. So what do we learn? What do we discover? And for those of you who are joining me for the first time, I should say perhaps that I too am not an American. You may be able to tell from my accent. I was born and raised in Scotland and moved to the United States only 7 years ago. So I have, I would hesitate to say, a similar perspective on the United States to Neil Gaiman. Hey, who does? But I have a similar feeling of objectivity, perhaps, mingling now with my subjective experience of the United States too. I think that there is an objectivity that comes only from the outsider's perspective. There is an objectivity that can only be arrived at when you are somewhat free, or at least conscious of that tidal tug and sway of cultural assumption, cultural predisposition, of that identity working its way into you, that identity having its way with you, that identity subsuming you and you subsuming it in this reciprocal kind of relationship. America is grand and broad and aspirational and dark and twisted and perverse and enormously brave and generous, courageous, but also mean-spirited. It also falters. So we're going to look at the ways in which the United States both embodies the myth that is created and fails the myth that is created equally. We're going to look at the way in which the myth that is created embodies the United States and fails the United States. So this entire complex discussion is always going to come back to that notion of cultural identity. And I particularly want to hear from the Americans in the audience. And I guess, okay, also the non-Americans in the audience. I particularly want to hear from all of you. You guys, you are always fantastic and brilliant and insightful and see things that I myself would never see. So this is, as so many of these sessions are, really part one of an ongoing discussion. I want to hear from you. I want to take those ideas and fold them into next week's session, and that will be all the more powerful as we move through the book and begin to arrive at the TV show too. Let me see. I have a lot of activity here in the YouTube chat, which was completely to be expected. There's a lot of discussion already. I love the notion of explaining modern phenomena, says Princess Ostrich, by myths, because we are really exploring modern problems which we don't really understand, like the people who came up with Zeus didn't understand lightning. Yes, the fundamental purpose of the metaphor is to make accessible the inaccessible. The reason that human beings speak figuratively is because the real world is incredibly complex. We can't always articulate those things that we observe. We can't always articulate our understanding of those things. Goodness knows we can't articulate those things which occur within us, those things which speak to belief and identity and desire. We can't always articulate them, so we turn instead to metaphor. And in that sense, the metaphor is not less true than the actuality, than the reality of the event, but is in some sense more true because it contains within it both the factual consequence, both the thing itself that we're discussing, the object of our metaphor, but also that entire halo of connotation and association that we bring with us. The metaphor that I would use to describe a rainstorm, for example, may not be the metaphor that you use to describe a rainstorm. And we have to acknowledge right up front that the specificities of those metaphors will be wildly dependent on our own cultural assumptions, on our own physical environment. Someone who lives in Arizona or New Mexico, for example, would speak very differently about the coming of the rain than someone who lives in New Hampshire or Maine. Those experiences, while they are purporting at least to describe the same event, the same natural occurrence, the metaphors that we will draw upon, the stories that we will tell, will be fundamentally different. And of course, because American Gods is part road trip, we begin to absorb that sense of differing perspectives. The United States is not a single culture. Even the states themselves are not single cultures. We are still within this nation fragmented. We are still possessed of unique identity. You know, I lived for a few years in New York State, in upstate New York, in fact, and could observe very readily the cultural difference between upstate New York and New York City, even though those things in the eyes of outsiders are unified, and still further unified into the notion of the entire United States by those who have never been here, who have never visited. The notion of Americanism as a single monolithic thing is something which must be repeatedly challenged in the course of this book, something which is, by Gaiman and by our interpretation, repeatedly challenged in the course of the book. The only other thing that I will say to frame this is to urge you to consider the words of Barthes, to read this book with the notion of the death of the author firmly in mind. Gaiman speaks with uncommon beauty and eloquence about his own work. And he has offered, though with more restraint than many authors, he has offered a few commentaries on this book, on what certain things mean and indicate. And while that is valuable, it is not definitive. It is not exhaustive. There are other ways of reading this book. And this text and the TV show, which will spring from it, require our unique and specific attention. We will interpret this text in variable ways, and each of those ways, as long as they are supported by the text, will be valid, will be true unto themselves. Metaphors are true, stories are true, even if they are separated from underpinning fact, even if they are separated from actual naturalistic accuracy. Yeah, good. Becca asks here in the YouTube chat, in what specific time is this book set? There is a strange disconnect that I think is intentional. It is absolutely intentional, I would argue. I think that it is set in the present, but broadly. It is set in a non-specific time because what it really is speaking to is a blur of contemporary America. It is the spirit of contemporary America. It is this gestalt of the last 20 years, 30 years, maybe. I mean, we can draw certain dividing lines. Pieces of technology are specifically referenced. Thus, we can say, well, it has to be later than this point. But even then, the magical realist nature of this story, the layer of thick, heavy, swollen metaphor over this story, even then will allow us to question exactly when and where. If you've enjoyed American Gods, by the way, and you're looking for something that is, in some senses, thematically similar, I urge you to take a look at the TV show Twin Peaks. Not for the content of Twin Peaks per se, but for the way that Twin Peaks also interrogates this notion of, in that case, very specific small town Americana. But it does basically what American Gods does with a much narrower focus and much greater depth. So I would urge you to take a look at that too. Yeah. Sarah says, that's why I forced my husband to read this. He's not American, but lived in the States for years. Very interesting perspective. Yes, yes, I completely agree. And of course, even then, when we're talking about the perspective of American readers, that's not unified. Your perspective is completely unique as a product of your upbringing, as a product of your background, as a product of your own experience. So we must be careful. We must resist the urge to blur all of America together into one. And I think that the book itself kind of pushes back against that somewhat natural desire. Human beings do. There is an understandable natural urge to collapse stories into single meanings, into simple lessons. But that is, we seek, when reading a story, to understand the story. And in order to understand the story, we want to simplify it. this book resists our desire to do that, and our reading together is hopefully going to resist the desire to do that too. Yes. Yes. Death or Glory Toad here on Twitter says that at Neil himself, at Neil Gaiman on Twitter, is a very articulate, very deliberate writer. Stands out his deliberateness. It's how he details and clearly speaks. Yes, I completely agree. He speaks beautifully about his own work. Yeah, good. Let me see here. I read this first years ago, so I don't remember it well, says, I'm pretty sure your name is Rachel. I always just call you Ramelosh because I like saying that word a great deal. I read this first years ago, so I don't remember it well, but where does it fit in the grand tradition of American road trip books? That's certainly something that we'll discuss as we move forward, because it definitely speaks to that road trip tradition, which is, in its way, as quintessentially an American art form as the Western or the gangster movie. You know, there are particular forms of art which are specifically indicative of the United States, and the road movie, the road story, is certainly one of them. From Kerouac and beyond, we explore the grandeur and the grand scale of the United States through these stories, and simply that sense of scale and scope informs our understanding of where we are and allows us to better frame and parse and interpret the experiences along the way. Yes, good, good. So many comments here in the YouTube chat. Yes. Setting is non-specific, says Sarah, but there are so many things that tie it to the early 2000s. Yes, broadly contemporary as it was written, but yes, not specifically contemporary, which I think is a really interesting pull here. Yes, good. All right, let's move forward then. Let's move forward into, I guess, the beginning of the book. And I want to begin by taking a look at the epigraph here from chapter 1. Let's take a look. Whoops, except that I have inadvertently moved ahead in my slides, so now I have to move back. Here we are. This is the epigraph from the first chapter. The boundaries of our country, sir. Why, sir, on to the north we are bounded by the aurora borealis. On the east we are bounded by the rising sun. On the south, we are bounded by the procession of the equinoxes, and on the west, by the day of judgment. The American Joe Miller's Jest Book. So Joe Miller was an actor, and after his death, there was a book published called Joe Miller's Jests, or The Wits Vade Mecum, in 1739. This is basically a collection of witticisms. It's a collection of aphoristic little utterances that are either simply comedic or are comedic with a broader point. This follows that tradition really rather beautifully, in that it is comedic, it is almost parodic, it is almost satirical of the Americans' sense of their own purpose and their own grandeur, but it also speaks very honestly, I think, to part of American culture, to part of the American myth. America is great. America is grand. America is large. The idea that you can be bounded not simply by geographical features, but by natural phenomena, by inevitable theological phenomena, is an enormously powerful one. It speaks to that sense of destiny. It speaks to that sense of purpose, that sense of being special. And if we have to distill American mythic culture down to one simple idea, I think it is uniquity. Americans believe more powerfully than any other idea in the uniquity of America. It is unlike other places. It is more special, more blessed, more true, more real, more large, certainly. It is America. And even here in this first passage in the book, we begin to look toward that idea. We begin to nod toward that idea. In what way is America unique? In what way is America special? Well, it is so large, so all-encompassing, so swollen with destiny that it can only be encompassed by the greatest and grandest things. It can only be matched by things of its own scale. And as I say, while that is partly parodic, while that is partly satirical, it is also true. It can be both of those things simultaneously. It's not pointed, I think, here in the first chapter, but it is purposeful. It is distinct. And it is, I think, too, somewhat affectionate. We must remember that as Gaiman was writing this book, he was I'm not sure that he would use this term himself, but he was, in a sense, falling in love with the United States. And that is a process that I myself have certainly undergone. You can be fascinated and charmed and curious about the United States, but over time, particularly if you take a road trip, particularly if you are connected to the land itself, this country will win you over. It will pull you in. It will absorb you into its narrative and be absorbed into yours. It does become never quite home, perhaps, never simply home, perhaps, but more than that. It becomes, as I said, a part of your identity. What do you guys make of this epigraph here? Supernatural, says Gene, feels very influenced by Gaiman. Cass alone feels like the writers were taking a page from Good Omens in a lot of ways. I would absolutely agree with that. I think that Supernatural feels like it's influenced by Gaiman. I would argue that Supernatural feels like it's influenced by American Gods a lot. There is a way in which Supernatural, I'm referring, of course, to the long-running mystery horror TV show, there is a way in which Supernatural speaks to these notions of American mythology and also wields peculiarly American iconography and symbolism as a part of its narrative device that is absolutely resonant with American Gods. Yes, I definitely see that. That's good. Oh yes, a few people have called that Supernatural. Yes, good, excellent. Yes, Chesley says America borders all forms of supernatural boundaries because of America's greatness. That's right. America is effectively, and I guess this is one of the things that we should look at here in this particular epigraph. America here is broadly synonymous with the world. The boundaries of our country, sir. Why, sir, on the north we are bounded by the aurora borealis, on the east we are bounded by the rising sun, on the south we are bounded by the precession of the equinoxes, and on the west by the day of judgment. I mean, metaphorically, that is true of all places. That is true of the world. Here we're seeing a connection between America and if not the planet, if not the globe, then at least humanity's place upon the planet, humanity's place upon the globe. We get the sense that American culture, for many of us, particularly over the last 50 years or so, is synonymous with culture. That to be a human being is to be an American. The mass export of culture from the United States has had a titanic effect, though interestingly now, and this I think has distinguished us in time even from the moments in which Neil Gaiman wrote this book, now we are beginning to see that challenged in a way that I don't think we would have anticipated even a couple of decades ago. Yes, good. Texas retains that American largeness, says Robert Hickok. The Midwest still has the vastness. The West has that fabulous horizon. Yes, good. Yes. Leslie Skipa, the wonderful Leslie Skipa says, historically and maybe on paper, America thinks of itself as a melting pot, a collection of so many cultures and such. It used to be a source of pride. I think... yes, obviously the notion of diversity, the notion of opportunity, the notion of social mobility, the notion of the American dream, these things are absolutely inextricable from our perspective on Americanism in the 20th century. Of course, they weren't always in quite the same way integrated with that notion of America, the place, or Americanism, the identity. But certainly within the 20th century, we've seen a swing toward that idea of egalitarian social mobility, of meritocratic social mobility. The way in which that is represented in this novel and the way in which it is challenged and subverted in this novel, I think is absolutely purposeful. That may be the most powerful piece of critique that Neil Gaiman offers. Yes, good. Yes, as Gene says, America's vastness makes the American identity a very complex concept. Again, something that we will explore and challenge as we move forward. Good. Good, excellent. Yes. Sarah says, Americans at a disadvantage because their culture is exported, but they know very little about day-to-day happenings in other nations. Robert Hickok says, in a similar spirit, America eschewed the musty closeness of other Western cultures, blowing the borders away into a long-range mystical fairy realm that is too vast for encapsulating with the ease of the others. That is beautifully written, Robert, and I completely agree. And Kate says, it is a surreal place. You have to be really open to the weirdness. Yes, I mean, again, all of this is true. America was founded on immigration, founded by immigrants, and those stories have coalesced and unified into that single narrative. What is most interesting, I think, is the way in which people have, the way in which generation after generation after generation of immigrants, obviously with innumerable exceptions. I would not for a moment want to suggest that this is the way that it works, but broadly speaking, the immigrant experience into the United States is one of subsumption. It is one of absorption. You become American, and that is a partly voluntary and partly involuntary process, I think. Certainly that has been true for generations back. Yes. Good. People around the world have forced knowledge of America, says Sarah. I mean, knowledge, certainly. Forced knowledge. The mass export of American culture, particularly American pop culture, is notable, is exceptional, is unlike any other cultural export in the entire world. But at the same time, I would hesitate with forced. I think that there is an osmotic pressure behind the spread, the dissipation of American pop culture around the world. And partly that is because American pop culture does not speak to these deep-seated cultural identities. If you have, for example, as I have, a strong notion of your Scottishness, a strong notion of your Scottish nationality and Scottish identity, that is an identity that goes back millennia. That is an identity that is so very deeply embedded in the ancient stone and soil of Scotland that it can't really be disentangled from that. But American pop culture is, relatively speaking, transitory. It's temporary. It is new and it is fresh, and it lacks those very, very deep roots. One of the key indicators and markers of American pop culture is this restless need for reinvention. America is a furnace and a forge for new kinds of art and new kinds of experience, and those arts and experiences pay little homage to the arts and experiences of the past. There are forcible breaks in American pop culture, which mean that it does spread, I think, a little more readily and a little more easily. That is not to say that there are not, multi-billion-dollar juggernauts behind the active propagation of American pop culture who are tapping into markets around the world. But in so doing, they are spreading specific pop cultural artifacts, movies, books, TV shows, albums, whatever, but they're also spreading in a more nebulous and less deliberate and more connotative sense the notion of America itself. I grew up in Scotland, and about half of my media consumption was British and half of it was American. And I am sure that is true for anyone who has grown up anywhere in the English-speaking world for the last 50 years. I think that's almost certainly going to be your experience. If you grew up in Australia or in New Zealand or in South Africa, if you grew up in Wales and you had a predominantly local cultural experience, I think that would be very surprising, very surprising. And I can speak less directly and less personally on the absorption of American pop culture by other cultures, but again, it is necessary. And the reason I'm talking so much about culture, of course, is that culture and myth and identity are all inextricably linked. We could talk about the spread of culture a little more readily and perhaps even a little more comfortably than we can talk about the spread of American cultural identity, but those things are, to a certain extent, one and the same. They are at least broadly connected, yeah, and intimately connected too. Yeah, good. Good. Yes. And again, of course, yeah, I'm talking very broadly here. There are numerous counterexamples too. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move in then, and well, let's meet Shadow, shall we? Let's begin by talking about Shadow's plan. And what I'd like you to do as I'm reading these slides here, I'm reading the slides in part for the audio version of this podcast, which you'll be able to download from Point North Media shortly after the live session ends. As I'm reading these slides, if you can call out interesting pieces of language, interesting ideas, interesting notions, interesting contradictions, details of plot, details of character, really whatever catches your eye as I'm moving forward here, by all means shout out in the YouTube chat and I'll try and stay on top of those. Yes. Okay. So let's take a look at our introduction to Shadow. Not quite our introduction, I guess, but at least the first real notion that we get of Shadow. And again, I have skipped ahead in the slides. This is awfully twitchy today for some reason. My PowerPoint in which I have created my slides is just awfully twitchy. Okay, this is the first slide. Shadow's lists got shorter and shorter. After 2 years, he had it down to 3 things. First, he was going to take a bath, a real, long, serious soak in a tub with bubbles in it. Maybe read the paper, maybe not. Some days he thought one way, some days the other. Second, he was going to towel himself off, put on a robe, maybe slippers. He liked the idea of slippers. If he smoked, he would be smoking a pipe about now, but he didn't smoke. He would pick up his wife in his arms. "Puppy," she would squeal in mock horror and real delight. "What are you doing?" He would carry her into the bedroom and close the door. They'd call out for pizzas if they got hungry. Third, after he and Laura had come out of the bedroom, maybe a couple of days later, he was going to keep his head down and stay out of trouble for the rest of his life. So this is our introduction really to Shadow. And as I said, though it isn't our literal introduction to Shadow, characters are defined in part by what they want. And this is one of the more powerful explorations of that you will ever see. That as Shadow's list of things retreats and retreats and retreats, he cuts it all the way down to 3 essential things: the bath, having sex with his wife, and then staying out of trouble. Presumably in part so that thing 1 and thing 2 can reoccur on a regular basis. Let's take a look and see what you made of it. "Smoking a pipe," says Robert Haycock. Yeah. "Pizza." Yeah. These are beautifully American, beautifully simple, beautifully and somewhat traditionally masculine perspectives. Certainly one of the things that we must observe about Shadow as we are introduced to him is his fundamental masculinity. His almost archetypal masculinity. Yes, that will become interesting as we move forward. Yeah. 3, says Cedar Heights, calling out the rule of 3s throughout this first chapter. 3 years in prison, 3 things on the list, $3 added to the phone call, 3 cups of mead. Yes, yes. Princess Ostrich asks, "Does the poor delivery person have to carry the pizza into their room?" See, sometimes I think you need like an emergency service you can call that will just drop off Powerade and Luna bars just on your doorstep. I mean, Amazon, I guess, is the emergency service that I'm thinking of. Yes, good. "Puppy is awesome," says Princess Ostrich. We'll talk a little more about Puppy in a while. Yes. "Food and drink are so deliberate in this novel," notes Sarah. I completely agree. Yes. Yes, it's not that they're going to eat, it's that they're going to send out for pizza. That's again, archetypal. We're getting a very traditional perspective on American masculinity of a very particular sort. Yeah, good, good. "Shadow, Shadow, Shadow," says Jean. "This character, I am always so enamored by Shadow every time I read the book." To which Sarah replies, "Shadow is very attractive." And I find that very interesting, honestly. That's, yes, that's, Shadow's attractiveness almost stands in contrast to his likability. He is troubled, he is driven, he is primal, he is fundamental in a sense. He is archetypal for reasons which will become very interesting to discuss much, much later in the book. He feels as though he is emblematic of something even when he isn't actively being emblematic of anything. He is more than a protagonist for this novel. He is, in a sense, the protagonist. He is the protagonist. He is, I keep circling back around to this word, but it really is the most effective word to use when describing Shadow. He is archetypal. And we are going to play with archetypes in very purposeful and specific ways as we move through. We're going to see, of course, the overlapping of mythology and of mythological character in particular and archetypal character. Yes. Good. "Media and Powerade and Luna bars," says Chesley. Absolutely. Rameler says, "Have you seen the meme of the person who didn't want to get out of bed, so gave the pizza person directions to their bedroom? They got their pizza." That is dedication. I hope they tipped extremely well. Yes. Good. Robert notes the pipe folks are most likely to refer to their pipes as female. Seriously, I did know that, Robert. I have smoked a pipe or 2 in my time. I may well, in fact, be smoking a pipe this evening as part of a little informal celebration that we get to share here in Oklahoma City to mark the birthday of Elizabeth Stevens, who I'm sure is known to most of you, the head of this entire wonderful community that has spread out. The head, she would hate that. The heart of this entire wonderful community that has spread out over the internet over the course of the last few years. So yes, I will probably be smoking a pipe on a porch in late evening sun later today. So I myself living my best American life right now. Yes, he's a sexy brooding dude, says Becca. I think I dated him. Yes, Shadow is just yes, says Sarah. Good, good. Robert says, offering a contrast here, Shadow is a very tightly bottled bomb of trouble, so much so that he's stifled almost throughout the entire book. And yes, that's rather beautifully observed, I think, Robert, because Part of what makes Shadow such an interesting character is that sense that he is never released, that he is never expressed, that as we meet him, we have already seen him bottle himself up. He's going to stay out of trouble. That is what matters. He's not going to express himself. He's not seeking greatness and grandeur, at least as we meet him at the beginning of the book. So there's always that, I was going to say illusion, but that's the wrong word, I guess, that intimation of profound depth, that again, to reference the first chapter here, that tectonic struggle within him, that pull of mighty forces within him, and all of that suppressed, all of that limited into this taciturn simplicity, this elemental simplicity as he moves forward. Shadow is, I will argue, one of the great protagonists of all time, one of the great literary heroes of all time, Yeah. Adamantine self-control, says Princess Ostrich here. Yes. Good. Excellent. Yes, there's a deliberate reason Shadow begins the novel in prison. Clever writer, says Gene. I completely agree. It allows us to enter his story late. It allows us to enter his story after he has been distilled almost, after he has been made elemental in this crucible of adversity. Yes, good. Good. Shadow would slap the brood right off of Angel, says Kate Matt, referencing Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Well, sure, but I mean, who couldn't? Good. Good. Excellent. Let's move on then to our, now that we have learned these things about Shadow, let's move on to our second slide and take a look at Shadow's superstitions, or lack of superstitions. This is Shadow's first engagement with belief, which is, of course, going to be terribly significant through the rest of the book. Shadow was not superstitious. He did not believe in anything he could not see. Still, he could feel disaster hovering above the prison in those final weeks, just as he had felt it in the days before the robbery. There was a hollowness in the pit of his stomach, which he told himself was simply a fear of going back to the world on the outside, but he could not be sure. He was more paranoid than usual, and in prison usual is vary, and is a survival skill. Shadow became more quiet, more shadowy than ever. He found himself watching the body language of the guards, of the other inmates, searching for a clue to the bad thing that was going to happen, as he was certain that it would. Shadow preempting here the imminent terrible news, which is going to absolutely shape his destiny, absolutely going to change the path of his life. He believes in nothing that he cannot see. He is an experiential literalist in that sense, and yet, paranoia. He feels the specter over him. He feels the storm on its way. That's not something that we can overlook. And it speaks to, I think, our most human tendencies to fill in the dark spaces of the world with belief, to fill in the dark spaces of the world with metaphor and with myth. Here, Shadow, a man who is leaning into this idea of absolute literalism, of a kind of factual theology. He believes only in what is literally, objectively, mechanically, functionally true in front of him. Even he sees shadows, and even he populates shadows with stories. It's impossible to overemphasize the importance of that. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of that. It is, again, fundamental to Shadow and his experience, and fundamental to humanity. Once again, almost immediately, Shadow is representative of the everyman. Yes. I wonder how long Shadow took to really believe, asks Robert, inclined to think he was convinced earlier than maybe the book explicitly indicated. I want very much to track Shadow's actual belief, the indicators of that belief as we move forward. Yes. And also to question the narration here, to interpret Shadow's actions and interpret what we are told about Shadow directly, and to see if there are gaps, to see if our narrator is an unreliable narrator. Good. Yes, yes. Excellent. You know that Shadow is massive almost from the very beginning, says Robert. Very massive, like a thunderhead that lingers on the horizon. Yes, good. All right, let's, so here we're establishing not just Shadow's personal superstitions, not just his personal interaction with belief, interaction with objectivity, interaction with with what we might think of as, I suppose, the world unseen, what we might think of as the depths beyond the surface of our own experience and the ways in which we populate that. Yes, the ways in which we seek to illuminate and be illuminated by that. This is all, again, fundamentally human. Yeah, good. Let's take a look at the next slide and the moment when Shadow gets the bad news about Laura. Again, we've just jumped ahead. This is terrible. And I do apologize for the problems with my slide. Here we go. Shadow, we're going to be releasing you later this afternoon. You'll be getting out a couple of days early. The warden said this with no joy, as if he were intoning a death sentence. Shadow nodded, and he waited for the other shoe to drop. The warden looked down at the paper on his desk. This came from the Johnson Memorial Hospital in Eagle Point. Your wife, she died in the early hours of this morning. It was an automobile accident. I'm sorry. Shadow nodded once more. Wilson walked him back to his cell, not saying anything. He unlocked the cell door and let Shadow in. Then he said, it's like one of them good news, bad news jokes, isn't it? Good news, we're letting you out early. Bad news, your wife is dead. He laughed, as if it were genuinely funny. Shadow said nothing at all. And as we talk about Shadow's elementalism, as we talk about Shadow's archetypalism, we must observe the way that Gaiman writes his responses. We get brief, succinct references to Shadow's actions earlier in the chapter. He is a masterpiece of efficient action and of taciturnity. He speaks and acts as little as is necessary, a constant desire to stay out of trouble, lest overacting or overspeaking somehow cross a line of which he is unaware and with which he is unfamiliar. But here this breaks down to that elementalism. Shadow nodded once more. Shadow said nothing at all. He is embodied in this simple action, and we are given no insight into what lies beneath. He is, in this moment, simply this action. He is simply this response. All that Shadow is nodding once more. All that Shadow is saying nothing at all. It's incredible. And it's such a sucker punch the first time that you read the book. I'm sure some of you who have just read the novel for the first time can absolutely testify. It is a sucker punch, and the worst thing is still to come. Yes, good. Oh, we're calling out. We're discussing. Yes, we're discussing Shadow's ethnicity here. As Kate says, Shadow is textually dark but racially ambiguous. Definitely not white. Yes. Absolutely not. We don't know any more than that. Again, and even in that sense, hey, he's archetypal. He is the everyman, though it is crucial, I think, as we'll discuss significantly later in the book, actually, before that becomes a real point of discussion, before we really have enough evidence to open up that discussion. We will discuss the ways in which Shadow's ethnic identity, his racial identity, his position of non-privilege is vital, is key, is specific, and is, of course, as everything is in a Neil Gaiman novel, completely deliberate. Yes, good. Jean says, and isn't the first person to say something like this, I feel when I first read, I had a strong sense of Native American Indian backgrounds as well, but that may be due to where I was raised and the importance of American mythic connection. Yeah, absolutely. Shadow did this, Shadow did that, quotes Chesley. Yes, yes. Good. Lauren says, I'll say that it's something they did really well with the guy who reads Shadow in the audiobook I'm listening to. He doesn't sound obviously any race. He is, it is a fantastic reading. This, I take it, is the full cast recording. If you haven't yet heard the full cast recording, I mean, I don't think it's perfect. I think there are a couple of performances with which I am somewhat less enamored than others, but I do think that it is extraordinary, and Shadow is perfect, absolutely perfect. So yeah, I can urge you to go and excuse me, I can urge you to go and listen to that. Yeah. Good. Excellent. As Sarah says, his memories show that he wasn't always like this. He's now a shadow of who he used to be. Yes. It was tempting, honestly, to begin this lecture with a 30-minute dissertation on Shadow and shadows, to talk about all the possible interpretations of his name, to consider the ways in which he is nominatively determined, the ways in which his name defines and bounds him. But I think it's more interesting and perhaps more rewarding to call those out as we move forward. The ways, in the many, many ways in which Shadow is emblematic of a shadow, the ways in which he is somewhat less a man, but somewhat more than a man too. So we'll definitely keep track of that, yes. Death or Glory Toad on Twitter says, at Neil himself allowed us to read into Shadow so easily. He leaves interpretation up to us, unlike most any other author. That is absolutely true. We will get much more description of other characters through the course of the book. It's not as though Gaiman can't write very specific and precise characterization, that he can't use it to devastating effect. But you're right, Shadow is consciously and deliberately, I think, almost a gap at the heart of this narrative. He is almost a placeholder for the protagonist, but not is the thing. He's not physically defined or limited in that sense, but he is, of course, emotionally defined and limited in exactly the way that he needs to be. Yes. Good. Good. All right. Let's push on to the next slide. And to Shadow's experience, now that he has left prison behind. I guess the one thing that I wanted to call out and kind of call back to before I leave this behind, honestly, guys, I could have just read the entire chapter to you. We could have just done a line-by-line reading of this first chapter in particular. We will accelerate a little as we move into the subsequent chapters, but the first chapter is so dense and so important and lays the seeds of everything to come. But here in the first chapter, I did want to call out the Histories of Herodotus. For those of you who perhaps aren't familiar, the Histories of Herodotus, the book that is given to the book that is given to Shadow by Loki Loismith they are histories, but they are mostly myths. They are mythic reinterpretations of history. So they tell the history of ancient Greece, but they do so in a manner that is completely compatible with ancient Greek myth too. So even though he's being handed a book on history, it's not entirely that simple, and not entirely myth either, but I guess more mythic than a modern history would be. Yeah, good. Yes, excellent. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide and our first intrusion, I guess, by something genuinely otherworldly. As the plane took off, he fell asleep. Shadow was in a dark place, and the thing staring at him wore a buffalo's head, rank and furry with huge wet eyes. Its body was a man's body, oiled and slick. "Changes are coming," said the buffalo without moving its lips. "There are certain decisions that will have to be made." Firelight flickered from wet cave walls. "Where am I?" Shadow asked. "In the earth and under the earth," said the buffalo man. "You are where the forgotten wait." His eyes were liquid black marbles, and his voice was a rumble from beneath the world. He smelled like wet cow. "Believe," said the rumbling voice. "If you were to survive, you must believe." We're going to move on just to the next beat of this in a moment, but there are a couple of things that I want to call out. Obviously, the buffalo head iconography here is connecting us immediately to a pre-United States vision of America, and I think that this is one of the instances in which Shadow's ethnicity may be referenced here. I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea that Shadow is at least partly Native American. I'm not sure, as I said, about the degree to which that is true, but it feels very comfortable and kind of narratively true to me. I also wanted to call out firelight flickering from wet cave walls. We're going to hit the very famous passage at the end of chapter 1 in just a few minutes, and when we do, I want you to think back to firelight flickering from wet cave walls. This is also obviously more literally significant, but it is also metaphorically significant. We're having particular ideas foreshadowed even before we reach them. Yeah, good. Yes. Don't mess with people in airports, calls out Becca. Anyone who has traveled also. Dead Greek is an amazing way to explain Herodotus. Yes, good. Yes. Yes, I do actually love Herodotus, and Jean is calling out Plato. Jean, if you would like to give a quick explanation of Plato's cave here in the YouTube chat, that would be wonderful. Clearly Plato, says Robert. Yes, of course, clearly Plato. Plato postulated the idea of Plato's cave. What if all of our experiences were as shadows cast by firelight on the wall of a cave? I'm sorry, I'll say that again with more emphasis. Shadows cast by firelight on the wall of a cave. Yes. How do we determine the realness of something? How do we objectively measure something's existence? Never mind something's fundamental meaning. Absolutely right. Good. Good. How does Shadow know it is the buffalo speaking in his own mind, making him think that? I actually rather like that. It's a kind of dream logic thing. Sometimes you know things in dreams, you know this is true, even though within the framework of the dream, there's no way for you to know that information. But yes, I like that very much. Good. Excellent. We must, though, look at the culmination of this little sequence, continuing from the buffalo telling, the buffalo-headed man, I should say, telling Shadow that he must believe. Believe what? Asked Shadow. What should I believe? He stared at Shadow, the buffalo man, and he drew himself up huge, and his eyes filled with fire. He opened his spit-flecked buffalo mouth, and it was red inside, with the flames that burned inside him under the earth. Everything, roared the buffalo man. Spun, and Shadow was on the plain once more. But the tipping continued. In the front of the plain, a woman screamed half-heartedly. I could probably talk for about a half hour on half-heartedly. That is such a fascinating piece of writing. That is so curious. What I love here, in the second paragraph in particular, and we see this grow. Those of you who have joined me in the There and Back Again seminar, in which I discuss the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, will have heard me talk about Tolkien's ability to move from register to register, that he can move down into very simple, mundane, almost homely language. He can talk bluntly and with commonplace idiom, but he can also elevate his language, and when he does it like very few writers in history. When Tolkien elevates his language, it goes beyond the operatic, beyond even, I would say, the biblical. At its very height, Tolkien's language is almost philosophically resonant. It almost bypasses the use of language itself. It becomes inherently iconic. I said that Tolkien can do that with a skill that surpasses most other writers. Very few can match him. Neil Gaiman comes perilously close to matching him. Look at the way that we've expanded our sense of language. Even the grammar and the sentence structure expands and expands to encompass greater ideas. He stared at Shadow, the buffalo man, and he drew himself up huge, and his eyes filled with fire. That's epic. It's impossible to read that and not be moved by the enormity, by the immensity of this experience. Yeah. Good. Let me catch up here with the YouTube chat. And we can talk too, of course, what do we mean by believe everything? Yeah. So we're all calling out the cave allegory. Excellent. Good, good, good. I like how Shadow draws on his experiences in prison, says John, and what he was told by other inmates when re-entering the world. Now as an outsider, John, that's a really interesting observation. He does do that. He draws upon these recent stories and uses them as a means of filtering his own experience. And oftentimes he will reflect upon a story and then dismiss it because it doesn't apply to him or because his circumstance is different. He will be mindful of it. He will check himself. He will check his thought process, check his instincts, check his actions, and then move forward. All of this, I think, speaks to Shadow's very real desire to stay out of trouble. He's constantly checking himself. He's constantly considering his actions to make sure that he isn't crossing one of these lines. And of course, so many of these stories too tie into terrible disaster. He doesn't want to get in trouble, so he remembers a story of someone getting in trouble and thinks, well, I'm not going to do that, or that doesn't apply to me. That's absolutely great. Yes. Everything is a social construct, says Becca. I agree, as you know well. Yes. Good. Let me see here. Okay, yeah, I guess we can talk about this. Chesley asks, how does a half-hearted scream work? My reading of that is that this is a social scream, as it were. That the woman has very likely flown before, has experienced turbulence before, is screaming in a way that indicates a response to the circumstance, but isn't actually authentic, isn't actually a genuine, emotional response. It is more of a conventional response, more of an instinctive response, and more of a social response. I think that's certainly one way of looking at it. The other, and perhaps more damning way, might be to consider how people spend their time on planes. This blurred and indistinct late 20th, early 21st century world, she probably didn't have, a smartphone or a tablet or possibly even a laptop computer, but she may have had a magazine, she may have had a book. She was perhaps distracted from the reality of her experience by some trivial piece of entertainment. So even as the plane tumbles and she has that fear response, the fear response is filtered and rendered incomplete by her distraction. Distraction is a really interesting recurring element here as we move through these first few chapters. We'll try and call that out too if it pops up on any of these slides. Good. A look at me scream, says Sarah Thomas. Notice I'm scared. Yes, exactly. That kind of obligatory performative scream rather than a genuine scream of human emotion. That's certainly how I read it. Yes. I completely tied this entire story to Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul by Douglas Adams, says Robert. Couldn't help it. Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, man. I could talk about that for a seminar, let me tell you. I love that book. Both that and Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. I think I might like those books more than I like Hitchhiker's Guide, you guys, which is an insane thing that a crazy person would say, but I'm super into Dirk Gently. Yes. Good. As Princess Ostrich says, oh my, these turbulences, dramatically fans with handkerchief. Yes, exactly. Performative, inauthentic. Good. All right, let's keep pushing on. Yeah, because I guess I don't really want to talk about the substance of Shadow's dream right now, and I don't particularly want to talk about the necessity of believing everything at this point, except to say that obviously we have been cued now to look at belief. We have been instructed by the text, and this is one of the reasons that the first chapter of this book is as dense as it is. It is a slow burn of a chapter. And that's not to say that it's difficult to read, but it is one of these books, in the first chapter in particular, which you absorb into your body, and only then does it unfurl itself. I remember the first time reading this, and every subsequent time, I read the first chapter and I put the book down, and then I think about the first chapter for a long while. I have to allow it to expand, to fill this creative space within me. The immensity of the secondary world, not at all dissimilar already to the immensity of America itself. So one of the reasons that it is so dense, I think one of the reasons that Gaiman takes such care to create this secondary world is that books teach you how to read them. All texts instruct you how to consume them. If you are watching a movie and there is a flat-out comedic sequence in the first 5 minutes, the movie is telling you this is a flat-out comedy. You can relax, enjoy it. Nothing's really going to matter. Nothing's really going to be significant. We're just going to have fun for 90 minutes, and that'll be that. If the movie then, excuse me, if the movie then zigs into a heartbreaking dramatic scene, viewers might feel betrayed by that because you're not living up to your promise, movie. You assured me you were going to be this thing. You put me into this narrative and emotional state, and then you changed the rules on me. And people generally hate it when stories do that. It is a breaking of trust. It is a betrayal of the reader's emotional investment, their creative investment in the text. In the first chapter of American Gods, Neil Gaiman teaches us how to read American Gods. He demonstrates for us with great acuity and a deft hand that this is a novel where detail will matter. This is a novel where depth will matter, where metaphor is present everywhere, where gallows humor will inform our responses and the responses of the characters too. The reason I think that the first chapter is so very dense is simply that it has to teach us what American Gods is. And I think it does so beautifully. So much so that if you're not thinking about it, you wouldn't even be aware of it necessarily. But I've thought about it. So now I'm aware of it every single time that I read it. Yes. All of that is to say that both the dream and the notion of belief will unfurl beautifully for us as we move forward. Yeah. Good. Dirk Gently is more deliberate, which is a weird thing even to say. No, Princess Ostrich, I think you're entirely right. I think you're entirely right. I do love Hitchhiker. I love the entire series. I adore those books. God, I like everything Douglas Adams ever wrote. The man was a genius. But if I have to, pick one of his two primary series to take with me, I will take Dirk Gently. Yeah, good. Do we drink when Alistair says, let's push on, says Leslie Skipa. Don't do that thing. Don't do that thing. It would harm you, and I don't want you harmed. That would be a terrible thing. Yes, I can't take responsibility. Good. Glancing at Twitter, says Gene, how long until Neil Gaiman is like, what WTF is this hashtag I keep getting referenced with, and acknowledges the podcast? Well, hey, I mean, it's only a matter of time till I get to interview him, right? I'd love to talk to him about this book. As I have said already, in fact, before even thinking about interviewing Neil Gaiman, the man speaks with beautiful eloquence and beautiful depth and care and thought about his work. I would absolutely love to interview him about the book, yes. So let's make that happen on Twitter, shall we? Good. Yes, good. We're looking at ways in which and Becca asks, is this why we get the Bilquis part right up front? It absolutely is. This, I'm sure, has killed more experiences of reading American Gods than anything else in literary history. I can't think of a more jarring transition than the last part of the first chapter, which we're going to discuss in just a few minutes, rapidly, before this whole session runs out of time, as it is wont to do. Yes, absolutely. That is why it is there. That is why it is as provocative and absurd and surreal and powerful and dark as it is. It is deliberately designed to teach us how to read this book, because then when we move into chapter 2 and we return to Shadow, there is darkness around him. The red room lingers in the frame of the story, and obviously to good effect later. Yes, excellent. Okay, so we're going to do this. I thought it was pronounced Bilquis, says Leslie Skipa. It's both. It's both. It really doesn't matter. I pronounced it Bilquis for years and years and years, but then I have heard the liquid U being used, so it's almost a Bilquis. It's almost a, you almost kind of turn that a little bit. So yes, yes. Should be a silent U, hence her saying with a Q. Yes, I completely agree. This is why I read it. This is why, because if she was saying Bilquis, why would she say, well, I guess still it could be Bilkwis. So we can settle on one, or we can continue to flip back and forth between the two. I'm perfectly happy to do so. Yes, it is one of those things that that particularly for the generation who read the book as it was coming out, where we didn't have ready access to YouTube, or even necessarily video interviews, necessarily audio interviews with Neil Gaiman or with other people associated with the text, that it was one of these words that you just kind of filtered yourself and then pronounced it. So the Lord of the Rings is replete with those. I had some comments. I did a Lord of the Rings seminar last night where I was talking about the previous king under the mountain in The Hobbit, who is Thrain or Thrain, depending on your pronunciation. And there are two camps, and those two camps will never reconcile. He is either Thrain or Thrain. His the kin of Thorin Oakenshield, who comes from the Iron Hills, is either Dain or Dane. I have started to move toward the former, I have to say, because it has a more, I don't know, there's a dwarven quality to it that I really like. So let's maybe pick it up, and we'll just call her Bilquis or Bilquis. We'll see where we are. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. They are pronouncing it Bilquis on the show, to answer Valerie's question here. That will be the right one, maybe, question mark, though of course we're only in promotional material right now, so I have no idea. I have seen an interview with the actress who's going to play Bilquis, whose name escapes me right now, unfortunately, but she looks extraordinary. I'm sure she's going to be fantastic. Yeah, good. Good. Did anyone notice he was repeating Song of Solomon? The Bible has some dirty bits, y'all, says Becca. Yeah, definitely check out Song of Solomon in the Bible. Some good Bible. All right, let's take a look. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We're not even talking about Bilquis yet, because first of all, we have to meet Wednesday. The man in the pale suit in the seat beside Shadow put out his arm and tapped his watch with his fingernail. It was a black Rolex. "You're late," said the man, and he grinned a huge grin with no warmth in it at all. "Sorry. I said you're late." The flight attendant handed Shadow a glass of beer. He sipped it. For one moment, he wondered if the man was crazy, and then he decided he must have been referring to the plane, waiting for one last passenger. "Sorry if I held you up," he said politely. "You in a hurry?" So we push from here. I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit, or I'm never going to be done. We push on from here to a discussion of Laura and what happened, and I'll just cut right ahead to this. We can talk about Wednesday a little more fully, I guess, possibly even when we get to chapter 2, or maybe even next week. "She died in a car crash," said Shadow. "It's a fast way to go. Other ways could have been worse." The man shook his head slowly. For a moment, it seemed to Shadow as if the man was insubstantial, as if the plane had suddenly become more real, while his neighbor had become less so. Shadow, he said, it's not a joke. It's not a trick. I can pay you better than any other job you'll find will pay you. You're an ex-con. There's not a long line of people elbowing each other out of the way to hire you. Mr. Whoever the fuck you are, said Shadow just loud enough to be heard over the din of the engines. There isn't enough money in the world. Here again, Shadow's sole desire is to stay out of trouble. We're introduced here to the idea of permanence and impermanence, presence and the lack of presence. And it is no surprise, I think, even within the frame, this is not anticipating movements next, but I think that we are cued already by the text to question this momentary insubstantiality from Wednesday. And in part, we have to wonder whether that is a function of Shadow's skepticism, whether it is Shadow has a lack of belief right now. He's not sure. He's not certain. He's trying to assert belief in the absence of belief, but it isn't quite the same thing. And we get this momentary flicker. So even here, we're tying together belief with the external world, and that's obviously going to be powerful. Yes. Yes, the clue was in his name, says Frau Kastorp. I'm not going to go more specifically than that, but yes, and the eyes, says Leslie Skipa. Yes, absolutely. This is one of the ways in which it's one of the ways in which Gaiman plays fair. I think there are secrets, there are disguises, there are pseudonyms and altered identities present throughout this book, and he plays pretty fair with them. The clues are all there, and certainly there are a handful which are perhaps a little obvious, and some which are less obvious. But yes, yeah, we'll get to that for those who haven't read ahead just yet. Yes, good. I really must advance. We have to talk about the Red Room, is what it comes down to. This is, as I said, an enormously provocative scene. It is a sharp contrast in tone. It's a sharp contrast in narrative voice almost, but it does send ripples and resonances out through the entire text, as well as providing a frame as dark as dried blood around the entirety of our experience of reading the book. So let's look here at the transition, the scene transition that carries us to the Red Room. In a dark red room, the color of the walls is close to that of raw liver, is a tall woman dressed cartoonishly in too tight silk shorts, her breasts pulled up and pushed forward by the yellow blouse tied beneath them. Her black hair is piled high and knotted on top of her head. Standing beside her is a short man wearing an olive t-shirt and expensive blue jeans. He is holding in his right hand a wallet and a Nokia mobile phone with a red, white, and blue faceplate. The Red Room contains a bed, upon which are white satin-style sheets and an ox-blood bedspread. At the foot of the bed is a small wooden table, upon which is a small stone statue of a woman with enormous hips and a candle holder. The woman hands the man a small red candle. "Here," she says, "light it." We are running a little long here in the seminar, so I can't parse every incidental detail, but good Lord, this is suffused with incidental detail. We are not only transported to this time and place through Gaiman's masterful use of detail, but each single element is evocative, is provocative, is reminiscent. It speaks to us of, well, of America. Standing beside her is a short man wearing an olive t-shirt and expensive blue jeans. The t-shirt and jeans combination, of course, perfectly natural. The olive t-shirt perhaps calling to mind army fatigues, calling to mind some kind of militaristic outfit, not necessarily explicitly, but there is a touch of that there. He is holding in his right hand a wallet. If there is a symbol of, post-consumerist America, then it is, of course, the wallet, and a Nokia mobile phone with a red, white, and a blue faceplate. The foreign mobile phone that has been safely sanitized by wrapping it in the colors of the flag. This is America. He is America, and it is not a terribly flattering description. Then, of course, we get the sense of discomfort immediately. We get the walls close to that, the color close to that of raw liver. That is not good. The woman, cartoonishly dressed, unreally dressed. We're stressing the frame of realism here already. Then, again, moving ahead with the slides before I'm ready to move ahead with the slides. She straddles him in one smooth movement, whispering, "I know, honey, I know you're paying me, and I mean, look at you. I should be paying you. I'm so lucky." He purses his lips, trying to show that her hooker talk is having no effect on him. He can't be taken, that she's a street whore for Christ's sakes. Well, he's practically a producer, and he knows all about last-minute rip-offs, but she doesn't ask for money. Instead, she says, "Honey, while you're giving it to me, while you're pushing that big, hard thing inside of me, will you worship me?" Well, I what? She's rocking back and forth on him. The engorged head of his penis is being rubbed against the wet lips of her vulva. "Will you call me goddess? Will you pray to me? Will you worship me with your body?" He smiles. Is that what she wants? "Sure," he says. "We've all got our kinks at the end of the day." She reaches her hand between her legs and slips him inside her. This is the beginning. This is the moment of transition. Practically a producer is getting called out. You guys, I love practically a producer more than I love most lines, more than I love most phrases in the English language. I adore practically a producer. It is perfectly gross and self-serving and egomaniacal. It is diabolical. But yes, it is perfect, just perfect. As Leslie Schipa says, practically a producer is how so many of the guys I met in LA describe themselves. He is exactly that guy. Yes. So this is the point of transition, and we must acknowledge, well, I guess one of those other primary factors associated with American identity. American identity contains within it a fascination with sex, a fascination with hyperbolic sex, a fascination with consumerized sex, a fascination with culturalized sex. Sex is a commodity. And it is no coincidence that Bilquis here is leveraging that, is manifesting that, but much more importantly, that's a fairly predictable piece of satire. If you're going to make a list of the 10 things that Neil Gaiman is going to satirize in his journey across the United States, that's definitely going to be on the list. But we turn immediately to something darker, but we don't separate. We don't stop telling the story of a cheap conquest in a motel room or a cheap hookup in a hotel room. Instead, we start to turn it into something else. Bilquis leads him, this unnamed client, along this path and does so beautifully, does so provocatively, does so sensually, darkly. It's tough to read long before we get to the actual turn. It's difficult to anticipate the movements of or difficult to anticipate the specific movements of the story, but guys, we know something bad is coming. And then, of course, we get to one of the most striking sequences in the book, one of the most provocative and challenging sequences in the book, but also, in a really interesting way, we get to one of the oldest and most fundamental metaphors in the book, because the metaphor of subsumption, the metaphor of being drawn into the body is, I mean, literally as old as myth. It is literally as old as human stories, and human stories are literally as old as human beings. This is one of the fundamental inversions of our expectations, inversions of a natural order. There is a rightness and a truth and a sanctity to this particular process, and it's in its natural occurrence. But in this specific instance, we don't. I can frame this a little better, perhaps, by saying it would be one thing to have Bilquis simply kill this guy, to drain him of blood, to ritually murder him in a way that draws power from him. But that would be incomplete, because Bilquis is still here connected to metaphor. She is still connected to the oldest story. Even here, she's practicing the oldest profession. He is being unborn, as Sarah says. Yes, good. He's the consumer being consumed, Sarah says. Sarah, you are on point with this. I couldn't agree more. Yes. But this is the point where we leave America behind. This is the point where we stop talking about American culture and American identity specifically, and move into something, as I said, older and more powerful. We move to this. This is what he sees. He is inside her to the chest. And as he stares at this in disbelief and wonder, she rests both hands upon his shoulders and puts gentle pressure on his body. He slip slides further inside her. How are you doing this to me? He asks, or thinks he asks, but perhaps it is only in his head. You're doing it, honey, she whispers. He feels the lips of her vulva tight around his upper chest and back, constricting and enveloping him. He wonders what this would look like to somebody watching them. He wonders why he is not scared. And then he knows. It is the making literal of the metaphor. It is the making literal of, I guess, if you're inclined toward Freudianism, as I myself am not, then it is the making literal of the subconscious fear, the literal oldest fear. This is the unmaking of the man. And it's dramatically powerful, as well, as I said, as being provocative, as being confrontational, as being true in that sense. Yeah. I feel like this is not the first time, Garrett, that someone has mentioned vor in one of my YouTube chats and followed it up with, do not Google that term. Do not Google that term, you guys. Just don't do it. But yes, it is fundamental. It is primal. And of course, throughout this, we're drawing the connection back to worship, to belief. Though here we're doing something very interesting. He begins by not believing, but in the act of believing arrives at belief. This is a fake it till you make it story of belief. It's a fake it till you make it story of worship. We arrive at the truth by practicing the semblance of truth. And that is going to be enormously significant throughout the book as we begin to look at ritual, as we begin to look at tradition, as we begin to look at observance. Certainly, by the time we move into the second chapter, we're going to be talking about the drinking of mead to seal a bargain. It's not true, but it is the semblance of truth. It is the ritual of truth. And through those rituals, we arrive at the truth. Through those rituals, we are, of course, well, certain among us are, of course, empowered. So straight away, Gaiman is setting out basically the core thesis of the book, not just a mechanic, not just a means of complicating the story or of driving conflict, but one of the core, thesis statements of the book. Yes. Good. Yes. Oh, as Sarah calls out, I just love this scene. I love how her belly goes flat. Yes, he is completely absorbed, and that is it is, of course, the reversal of that much more naturalistic birth process, that more conventional, more true birth process. We are perverting that into something dark and wicked edged. Yeah, good. Okay, let's take a look at Chapter 2, I guess, guys. Hey, you know what? We're halfway through our reading, and I'm almost out of time. Luckily, Chapter 2 shifts the tone radically, because in Chapter 2, we begin to move into the road movie part of this story. We begin to move into the travelogue part of this story. And while it is beautiful and haunting, while it weighs upon the spirit and illuminates the soul, it is impressionistic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time pulling out excerpts, pulling out slides. I have 4 slides for the entire second chapter, because really that's what it collapses down into. It telescopes down into those moments, and the suspension between those moments, these moments of infinite horizon and lowering sky, create a sense of space that was entirely absent from the first chapter. And in part, of course, that's narratively purposeful, because we're tracking Shadow in the moments of his release. It is a wide, wide, wide world. And he is inhabiting it. He is moving through it, and he does so slowly. He does so with purpose, yes, but also with this sense of his own smallness within this broad world, speaking again to the magnitude of America in myth. Yeah, good. Was it just me, says Lauren, or did it seem like they were in the bar forever? It takes forever. Contrast the length of that scene with the length of any individual scene in the first chapter, and there's no comparison at all. They're in the bar forever, and we go again and again and again. We're cycling these same ideas and these same motifs, these same interactions, really, but we're doing so deliberately to create that space. Now Shadow is free. Now the world is large, and now, and I think this is beautifully subtle. Certainly we see it as he gets into his fight with Mad Sweeney, but it's beautifully subtle that now Shadow's means of staying out of trouble are going to serve him much less well. Before, he could orient himself by the guards and by the other prisoners. He could, as he noted himself, look at their body language. He could have that sense of looming danger, of looming evil, but he could still orient himself. Now, in the wide, wide world, there are no means by which he can orient himself. He will come to means by which he can orient himself. Yes. Let's begin with the introduction then of our man here, of Mad Sweeney. "You working for a man then?" asked the bearded man. He was not sober, although he was not yet drunk. "It looks that way," said Shadow. The bearded man lit his cigarette. "I'm a leprechaun," he said. Shadow did not smile. "Really?" he said. "Shouldn't he be drinking Guinness?" "Stereotypes. You have to learn to think outside the box," said the bearded man. "There's a lot more to Ireland than Guinness." "You don't have an Irish accent." "I've been over here too fucking long." "So you are originally from Ireland?" "I told you, I'm a leprechaun. We don't come from fucking Moscow." Mad Sweeney, fan favorite character. Not a character that works spectacularly well for me, at least in his initial appearances, I have to say. He doesn't contain the grit and the depth of Wednesday, is what it comes down to. He doesn't quite hold that gravitas that Wednesday holds, and certainly that gravitas that Shadow holds. But that's necessary because we have to add texture to the narrative at this time. Yeah. As Princess Ostrich says, I love that. "Hi, I'm a leprechaun." Sure. I do kind of wish he had an Irish accent. If he hadn't specifically called out the fact that he doesn't have an Irish accent, I would read him in an Irish accent, because the cadence of his dialogue is so beautifully observed. He doesn't have an Irish accent, says Shadow, and yet he speaks clearly with Irish intonation, with Irish rhythm and with Irish cadence. It fits beautifully. Gaiman is an undersung master of dialogue, I would say. That's not generally where he's praised first or most, but it's true nonetheless. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's Shadow has a burger, says Skipa. How very American of him. Yes, of course. Let's look at Mead then. Again, I feel like I've already talked about this slide because I've already talked about this slide, but here we are. Wednesday stared at Shadow with his mismatched eyes. One of them, Shadow decided, was a glass eye, but he could not decide which one. "I brought you mead to drink because it's traditional. Right now, we need all the tradition we can get. It seals our bargain." "We haven't made a bargain." "Sure we have. You work for me. You protect me, you help me, you transport me from place to place. You investigate from time to time, go places and ask questions for me. You run errands. In an emergency, but only in an emergency, you hurt people who need to be hurt. In the unlikely event of my death, you will hold my vigil. And in return, I'll make sure that all your needs are adequately taken care of." "He's hustling you," said Mad Sweeney, rubbing his bristly ginger beard. "He's a hustler." "Damn straight I'm a hustler," said Wednesday. "That's why I need someone to look out for my best interests." The beautiful combination of honesty and dishonesty from Wednesday, of course, illuminative even this early in the book. Look at the terms here of the bargain. We've talked a little about the mead already, the observance of ritual, even in the absence of true power. We do the thing because in the shape of the thing, we find the truth of the thing. It's a way into belief rather than a manifestation of belief itself. The ritual matters not for the ritual's sake, but for the belief that it engenders, for the power that it grants. Again, we do the thing because of the thing. You work for me, you protect me, you help me, you transport me from place to place, you investigate from time to time, go places and ask questions for me. You run errands. In an emergency, but only in an emergency, you hurt people who need to be hurt. In the unlikely event of my death, you will hold my vigil. I kind of want to just urge you all to print that paragraph out, or to write it out on a Post-it note and attach it to the side of your computer, because it is going to be so very significant later. It is going to matter so very much in the course of the book, and in ways which are both, I think, immediately evident in the text, immediately explicit in the text, but also not so much. I have just run out of time, so we are going to cover the last two slides very, very swiftly here, because we're going to cut ahead to Eagle Point, and we're going to cut ahead to Laura. And again, if the first half of this chapter is slow, the second half of this chapter is nigh glacial. That sense of space and crawling time, of Shadow's insistence but also reluctance, the necessity of this thing and the awful depth of this thing. It's hard to read, but we're going to get through it very quickly, and we'll probably revisit Laura a little bit at the beginning of next week's reading. Laura lay with her eyes closed and her arms folded across her chest. She wore a conservative blue suit he did not recognize. Her long brown hair was out of her eyes. It was his Laura, and it was not. Her repose, he realized, was what was unnatural. Laura was always such a restless sleeper. Audrey placed her sprig of summer violets on Laura's chest, then she pursed her blackberry-colored lips, worked her mouth for a moment, and spat hard onto Laura's dead face. The spit caught Laura on the cheek and began to drip down toward her ear. The powerful images of a dead woman named Laura, of course, one of the more explicit references between, or not references perhaps, but shared elements between American Gods and the aforementioned Twin Peaks. Here we learn through Audrey's actions what transpired in the moment of Laura's death, that she was in the midst of an affair, that Robbie and she were having at the very least a physical affair, and Shadow has trouble dealing with that. The conversation is awkward, is painful, is hurtful, and again, takes forever. We are now moving so slowly through this book, through this experience. We are with Shadow as this unfolds glacially, awfully, terribly, horribly. Let's move on to the last beat here. And as I said, we'll revisit some of this at the beginning of next week. If you have questions about Laura, if you have questions about Eagle Point, if you have passages that you wish I would pull out, get in touch with me. Either use StormsOTW on Twitter, or you can email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. This is our last slide for this first session of Storms on the Way. There was something he wanted to say to Laura, and he was prepared to wait until he knew what it was. The world slowly began to lose light and color. Shadow's feet were going numb, while his hands and face hurt from the cold. He burrowed his hands into his pockets for warmth, and his fingers closed about the gold coin. He walked over to the grave. "This is for you," he said. Several shovels of earth had been emptied onto the casket, but the hole was far from full. He threw the gold coin into the grave with Laura, and he pushed more earth into the hole to hide the coin from acquisitive gravediggers. He brushed the earth back from his hands and said, "Good night, Laura." Then he said, "I'm sorry." He turned his face toward the lights of the town and began to walk back into Eagle Point. Again, we have Shadow's retreat from complex three-dimensional personhood into archetypal elementalism. Here, he walked over to the grave. "This is for you," he said. The language is as blunt and as simple, as direct, as lacking in ornamentation as it can possibly be. And yet, it is still fully Shadow. It still completely embodies who he is. That, I'm afraid, is where we will have to wrap it up. We will pick up, though, with the next session next Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern for chapters 3 and 4, and as I said, maybe a little of this one too. I apologize for running a little long and for not spending as much time on chapter 2 as I wanted to. Chapter 1 is just so dense, you guys, and you are all so wonderfully, wonderfully smart. The coin, says Robert. So well done. We're talking about Guinness in the YouTube chat, which I missed. That's wonderful. Narnia says, totally saw the affair coming. Yes, me too, I'm afraid, because why would you foreshadow something that was so simple? Yes, yes. Good. Audrey sucks. Fair. Fair, though I think we can understand her, her hurt here. Yes. Good. You can always trust a dishonest man to be dishonest, says Narni. That's really good. Good job. Yes. All right. Let's wrap it up there. Guys, thank you all so much for joining me with this delayed session. As I said, we'll pick up on Tuesday. We'll be right back on schedule. It's all completely fine. There is, as of this recording, a Storms on the Way podcast feed available through iTunes. So keep your eyes peeled to Point North Media. All the links will go up there. You'll be able to subscribe and like and rate and review and do all the things that you do over on iTunes. I absolutely appreciate your support. If you enjoy this podcast, I would ask two things of you. The first, hey, tell a friend. It's always fun when these discussions are overflowing, when we're blowing the doors off the YouTube chat. It's always engaging to do that. Secondly, you can help me do more of this kind of thing by heading on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. There are already a number of one-shot discussions available over there. I've talked about the 1988 fantasy film Willow. I've talked about the 2010 cult classic Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I've talked about the 2011 Woody Allen movie Midnight in Paris. I did that just earlier this week. So there's a lot more of this kind of analysis, of this kind of discussion. I'm grateful to you all for showing up. I will talk to you all on Tuesday. Until then, take care.